listening to We Need to Talk About Bryce, Courageous Conversations with Bobby Henry and Guests, a podcast where we engage in courageous conversations using Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce's 1922 pamphlet, The Story of a National Crime, as provocation. I'm Bobby Henry, and I am the host of this podcast. I am a community member of the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory community. I am an assistant professor at Brock University and a PhD student in the Indigenous Studies PhD program at Trent University. For those unfamiliar with Dr. Peter H. Bryce, he was Chief Medical Officer of the Department of Indian Affairs from 1904 to 1921. During this time, he examined health conditions in residential schools and wrote yearly reports calling for changes to the way Indigenous children were treated. His reports were ignored. After retirement in 1921, Dr. Bryce felt compelled to speak more broadly and publicly on the issue, and in 1922 he self-published The Story of a National Crime, in which he directly petitioned King George V and Canadian Parliament to act on the matter of the health of Indigenous children and the conditions in residential schools. In 2022, as we record these episodes, it has been 100 years since the publication of this report. In this time, a lot has happened, a lot has changed, and a lot has stayed the same. This podcast is part of Defining Moments Canada's Bryce at 100 project, which aims to create educational resources to help educators bring this ongoing defining moment of engaging in truth and reconciliation, truth before reconciliation, into their classrooms. In each episode, we will listen to excerpts from the original report as recorded by Morriseau. Guests will react to what we have heard, and then I will lead an open conversation circle to discuss the context, implications, and contemporary realities connected to Bryce's report. In today's episode, we will be hearing the opening minutes from the first 2 pages of Bryce's 1922 pamphlet, The Story of a National Crime, and we'll be discussing its ongoing relevance, its commemoration, and living history. My guests today are Morriseau, a Métis journalist and special correspondent at ICT News, who recorded the audio we'll be listening to throughout this series, and Amanda Merpaw, a Franco-Ontarian writer and educator and project coordinator for Defining Moments Canada's Bryce at 100 project. Let's start by listening to today's excerpt. If you're reading along, we are listening to a reading of pages 1 to 3. You can access The Story of a National Crime on Defining Moments Canada's website via the link in the show's notes.
The Story of a National Crime by Peter Henderson Bryce, M.A., M.D. Being an appeal for justice to the Indians of Canada, the wards of the nation, our allies in the Revolutionary War, our brothers in arms in the Great War. Published by James Hope and Sons Limited, Ottawa, Canada, 1922, price 35 cents. The Story of a National Crime, being a record of the health conditions of the Indians of Canada from 1904 to 1921, by Dr. P. H. Bryce, M.A., M.D., Chief Medical Officer of the Indian Department. 1. By order in council dated January 22, 1904, the writer was appointed medical inspector to the Department of the Interior and of Indian Affairs and was entrusted with the health interests of the Indians of Canada. The order in council recites, "The undersigned has the honor to report that there is urgent necessity for the appointment of a medical inspector to represent the Department of the Interior and Department of Indian Affairs. The undersigned believes that the qualifications for the position above mentioned are possessed in an eminent degree by Mr. Peter Henderson Bryce, M.D., at present and for a number of years past Secretary for the Provincial Board of Health of Ontario, and who has had large experience in connection with the public health of the province. Signed, Clifford Sifton, Minister of the Interior and Superintendent General of Indian Affairs." For the first months after the writer's appointment, he was much engaged in organizing the medical inspection of immigrants at the seaports. But he had early began the systematic collection of health statistics of the several hundred Indian bands scattered over Canada. For each year up to 1914, he wrote an annual report on the health of the Indians published in the Departmental Report, and on the instructions from the minister made in 1907 a special inspection of 35 Indian schools in 3 prairie provinces. This report was published separately, but the recommendations in the report were never published, and the public knows nothing of them. It contained a brief history of the origins of the Indian schools, of the sanitary condition of the schools, and statistics of the health of the pupils during the 15 years of their existence. Regarding the health of the pupils, the report states that 24% of all the pupils which had been in the schools were known to be dead, while one school on the File Hills Reserve, which gave a complete return to date, 75% were dead at the end of the 16 years since the school opened.
For those listening, we just listened to the first 3 pages of the National Crime pamphlet that Peter Bryce wrote. That, from in respects to the work, it's always mind-boggling when I look at and hear this truth, to know that this tragedy happened in Canada. Also to the fact that not only did this happen in Canada, but this happened to children in residential schools. Looking at that number, it kind of strikes me over and over when I hear this truth, especially when you account for the amount of death toll that was happening in residential schools. So for me, it really gets to the sheer neglect and misunderstanding of Indigenous people, and the fact that this happened in our history, and that this truth is part of our collective history. And for me, it's striking because looking at that number, 75% were dead by the end of the 6 years of the school that was the report was speaking to in the first few sections here, and the File Hills Reserve. That's striking when you're thinking about children and what children mean to Indigenous communities. And I always have the question come to mind when hearing this truth of residential schools is, how could this have happened? And would this have happened in Indigenous communities when you account for how Indigenous communities view and revere children? From our philosophy, and I speak a lot from my custom, the Haudenosaunee traditions, we have the belief, and we follow this tradition to this very day, that children are our future. So when children are neglected, when children are abused or outright sent to residential schools or a place of education and perish in the name of education, it contradicts and goes against a lot of our customs in terms of what we understand the significance of our children to be. Because ultimately, when children are affected by virtue of our understanding that that is our future that we're messing with, and we are not to take it lightly. And so for me, I just want to open up that part of the discussion to get started here. So we'll go off to our first guest here today, Miles Morriseau, who's joining us today. We'll pass over to you for a few minutes to get your response, and then we'll go to our next guest, Amanda, after that as well.
Yeah, I think the numbers are always shocking. You know, when you look at this reality, the statistical researched, the man went out and gathered this information and presented it, in a very just a very factual manner. Like these are the numbers. This is what we're dealing with here, and it's a national crime. I mean, calling out the government at the time for this neglect that he brought to their attention a number of times. There were smaller reports that he had collected along the way, and so coming to this, and as an Indigenous person whose grandmother went to residential school and knew that was part of our family history. But as we come to face this reality, as things become exposed more and more, we become aware of what the true reality was for our parents or our grandparents, or even folks of my generation, not much older than my generation in northern Manitoba, who went to those schools. And you look at your friends or cousins and think what their experience must have been like, living and experiencing that reality in those institutions. And so it is coming to, you're dealing with, as I like to say in this process, making people understand that this is a living history. This is something that we live with. And so as these truths become uncovered, there's a reality that we are processing that in our very own personal way. So I'll pass it to Amanda.
Thank you so much. And I'm speaking today not from an Indigenous perspective. I'm Franco-Ontarian and an educator, and I've been teaching history for about 10 years now in Toronto. the grade 7 curriculum, which very much engages in conversations around the history of colonization leading up to the opening of residential schools. And I think a lot about when we listened to that, the excerpt of The Story of a National Crime, even just the title itself, right? That in 1904, as Dr. Peter Bryce is engaging in these inspections of residential schools, that he feels confident that he can call it a crime being committed, right, by the nation. When we think about how residential schools continue to be talked about by non-Indigenous peoples living here in Canada on Turtle Island or the government, even in the early 1900s, right? Somebody working for the government was able to call it a crime. It's sort of shocking how much we're still having conversations today about the seriousness of what happened, right? The trauma of what happened and the tragedy of what happened. That it's been 100 years since Peter Bryce self-published this report, which very clearly states these statistics that I think have long been known in Indigenous communities. I just find it really striking, this idea that he was able to call it a crime at the time and how much he was dismissed. And I think from the perspective of what is the moment that we find defining Moments Canada's perspective, it's not just commemorating or engaging with the report itself as a moment that was definitive, right? Somebody made the choice to speak out against the government that he was working for to publish this information, but also the fact that it was ignored, that he tried for years to submit these reports to Duncan Campbell Scott, who was head of the Department of Indian Affairs at the time, and he was ignored. They weren't acted on. And then you think about, well, what did the Canadian media do at the time? Who else in Parliament was working? Like, what was definitive wasn't just Bryce. It also strikes me that what was definitive was the response of the government and of non-Indigenous Canadians. And I think that's part of the living history now as well.
I think for one of the points that I was, that is an issue for debate, whether it's factual or not, is we're talking about this process of, that is connected with this story and what's ongoing part of our current Canadian reality is that, the number of unmarked graves that are around residential schools. People, there's hundreds. Like people don't want to say thousands. Like they want to say that, right? Which is a dismissal of Bryce's work. He's telling you, starting back then that hundreds of kids are dying. They don't care. So what do you think's happening? Do you think they're respecting these children's remains and shipping them home? No, they're just burying them in the backyard. That's the reality. And yet we live in a time where that reality is still being questioned. So, that's one of the issues that we currently have to deal with. And the reality that where so much of what is real and what is true and what is the history is now being questioned so openly. I mean, there's without a doubt, there are people out there saying, oh, this was all made up back then. Today, right? It is a point in history where what is real and what is truth is really important. And reconciliation, people always assume reconciliation of a friendship. Well, if there was no friendship, then that reconciliation has to be a reconciliation of what the truth was, what really happened. And obviously that document 100 years ago was a fact-based, a science-based, statistical-based report.
Thank you for elaborating on Amanda's point, Miles. It's getting into a lot of what we have to deal with as Indigenous peoples. And I think what you're talking to is the masses in terms of who looks at this history, what stories is privileged and what story is deprivileged when it comes to our history as Indigenous peoples. But it's also not just Indigenous peoples' history, right? When we think of largely this topic, I say our history in the context of Canada. People like to hold on to the notion that Canada is free of colonialism. When you think of it as the comparison between Canada and the United States, the war on Indigenous peoples in the United States was much more aggressive. And it's only because the United States had more finances to fund their army and fight against Indigenous peoples. And Indigenous peoples themselves resisted it. Those stories of resistance also happened in Western territories as well, but people almost like to clutch to that idea Canada has no history of colonialism. And I think Stephen Harper talked about that in after his apology in 2008. I think 3 or 4 months later, outright said to an international stage that Canada has no colonialism. It's great to hear your responses and what you both are thinking about in terms of this report, because I know later in this story, Peter Bryce was actually pushed out of office for publishing this report, and this whole notion that this history there's a history that, and I know Cindy Blackstock talked about this when she came to Brock University to deliver a presentation to students, faculty, and staff, is that there's this belief and our consciousness that historically they didn't know any better, right? It's always under that understanding what happened historically is only because they were just figuring things out, how to work with Indigenous people. We can go back to Bryce's report and his research, like you said, Miles, it's fact-based knowledge, it's fact-based history, and find out that they knew then how to fix the problem. But what they chose to do instead was nothing. And I think that's really what we need to keep moving forward with this discussion. And you're right in terms of something you said too, going back to a point you mentioned earlier, Amanda, about that we still have these conversations, that it's still uncomfortable, remarkable that we still have these conversations. And I think the conversations will never stop. But I think something that was coming to my mind is we're having these conversations because there's a lot of people that don't know this truth, right? And you're getting to the point in terms of why it's called a national crime. And that's a very powerful word choice in the 1920s for a non-Indigenous person and the government to basically call his own work and what he's finding in the government he's working for to be committing a national crime. And so I like these ideas, and I want to continue this conversation and develop these ideas more, because there's so many, points to it, and there's so much to this story. Like the point about people don't want to say thousands. They're comfortable saying hundreds, but they don't want to say thousands. And we need to have a conversation on, well, what does that mean for Canadians? But I want to go back to some of the points that I've kind of generated some questions here to understand this report in the context of why we have this report being read on an audio file from you, Miles. I'll just pose a question to you particular, because I know you were involved in the creation of the audio files yourself, as you yourself are reading the report. How did you get involved in coming to do this project? Like, what was your urge and your mission or your personal quest, or is it a form of healing? Tell us what made you go about doing this report, like reading the national crime story in this report, because it is, for me, even listening to it, it is quite triggering hearing this truth. And I just want to open up the conversation to yourself, as you're the person who's reading the report.
I couldn't get through the report the first time I read it. I just couldn't get through that. Even that first part that we just heard, it was overwhelming. It was triggering, as you say. I mean, and through this whole process, my grandmother, who I just adored, was just absolutely just an amazing, loving, caring woman, very spiritual woman. And I just had just laughing and full of love, right? This is my grandma. And as these truths become revealed, you're like, oh, as I say in my piece, for Canadian, for Canada's History magazine, and I say I knew that my grandmother went to residential school, but I didn't know what that meant. I mean, I knew that it meant she went to this school, and then as the layers of this, this thing just keep revealing themselves, and you realize what more and more what that could possibly mean, to understand that this person that you love so much went to this institution as a child, and what could that possibly mean? So we carry these things, and we know also, as we look at our communities, we study our communities, we see our families, and we begin to understand more and more what all this, intergenerational legacy of surviving residential school and all the, the violence and the breakdown of the family, all of these things that, are now connected to this, that this 100-year or longer history of what happened to our people. We just struggle so much to live with it that if you want to, like when I worked at Aboriginal Healing Foundation, I came out of there, having really faced that history for the first time. And then I would just like, I saw everything in that lens. Oh, that's why this is happening. Oh, why I see it now. But it's ongoing, and it's a journey of us, us reconcile, our job as Indigenous people is almost, this generation to just reconcile with our own history, right? And our stories and reconcile with the stories that we lost and the languages and the traditions that we lost that we want to connect with. So but all of these things are part of what it is to be Indigenous in Canada and to be, to see these things, to see these stories on the news, and know that it can have that response where it is something that can be overwhelming. And so, and at the same time, our responsibility is that we have to be able to share this information in order to reconcile with it. So it was we had that discussion about perhaps it would be a good idea to be able to read it. That would open it up to so many more people, have an opportunity to engage with this reality, and for people who just wanted to, the podcast thing, they just want to pop it in while they're driving or they're heading wherever, and gather that information. So just felt that it was important to and that it needed to open it up to a wider audience and to have an Indigenous voice and an Indigenous, it was pretty, we did it almost raw. I don't think I didn't, it was the read is kind of rough, and it's because that is almost the first, it is that, that's the kind of way that we wanted to share that. And there was another point, there's and I'm not going to try to pronounce the name, but there's a famous Iroquois scholar and intellectual by the name of Burning Sky, who passed away in 1922, and who was had spent time at Oxford College and was on his way to visit Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was one of his buddies, and that's when he died. And it was that 1922, and it was that understanding as well that's how this information would have been shared as well, that we had our intellectuals who spoke many languages who would come and say, well, this is what, this was what was presented. This is the story of a national crime. And so that was part of the idea as well.
Thank you for sharing that. And for me, just in response to everything you're sharing, and, there's a lot of feeling and there's a lot of personal quest and personal uncovering of your own story. And I think that strikes close to home for me, and I think a lot of people who are of Indigenous background can relate to it. And your point about it is our job, like that's what it means to be Indigenous in Canada. It's also to know our familial histories. And for me myself, that's something that was striking, even in your response as well, to know what she went through. Like in you referring to your grandmother, she went to the school, but you did not know what that meant. And for me, that clip hits very close to home because my father's dad went to residential school in the Mohawk Institute, which was one of the earliest industrial schools in 1832, and closed its doors in 1970. It's kind of a common theme even in literature too, because I'm reading this book, Five Little Indians by Michelle Good, and something there in that, one of the characters are talking about how these children went to residential schools, and they were talking to this other other Indigenous person in the story. I don't want to give too much information for anyone who's never read the book yet, but there's this dialogue in this blip in the story where one of the characters is dating this other Indigenous person or living with him, and he heard of residential school as an Indigenous person, but he personally never went. And the people who did go to the school would always go back to the point that to not talk about it, or that he would not understand what I meant by going to one of those schools. And so for me, that point is really pivotal in terms of what this is about.
we know many people had went to residential schools. So, statistics is put over 150,000 children in Canada went to residential schools through their operation. We know they went, but to not know what it means is what people don't quite know. So there's a lot of points to what this is, and I think it's great that you've made this quest of your own to make this more available, readily available to anyone who wants to listen to a story of a national crime. I want to take time to go to Amanda, and if you want to join in the discussion too as well, because there's a lot here we're talking about, and I want to also see your perspective because you joined us from Defining Moments Canada, right? You're a lead in this project, and it's great to see from an organization perspective what you're seeing and how your insights are harmonizing with what Indigenous peoples are doing at the grassroots.
Yeah, thank you. And it's so wonderful to be here in conversation with you both. And thank you, Miles and Bobby, both of you for sharing from very deeply personal places. I think in my own journey as an educator and just as like a person in the world, something that really impacted me was reading Susan Dion's work. She's a Potawatomi Lenape education scholar, and her book, Braiding Histories, which I read when I first started teaching, talks about this idea of how non-Indigenous Canadians, and she specifically looks at educators, position themselves as the perfect stranger towards Indigenous peoples, right? This idea that like, I don't know enough about that to be engaged in teaching about that, or I didn't learn about that when I was growing up. So, it's just something that I'm going to set aside. And she calls it something like a story that most of us would rather forget, right? Therefore, we don't engage in it. And I think that idea is something that really, really sits with me as an educator who has been tasked with a curriculum now in Ontario that explicitly asks that we talk about and teach about residential schooling and the history of colonialism. And that many Canadians who are in positions of authority in the classroom or leadership within the school system still hold on to this idea that Canadians are like fundamentally a peacekeeping nation, right? And that what happened in residential schools at the hands of non-Indigenous peoples, right, the government and the church, there's like a cognitive dissonance for people who buy that idea that we are fundamentally peacekeepers. We are fundamentally people who accept everybody as they are, and that's who we are as Canadians. We always defend human rights. How could we ever have been part of anything that wasn't that? She talks about how dangerous it is, right, for teachers to go into the classroom, for a non-Indigenous teacher to show up in the classroom who's been tasked to attend to these stories, who don't want to, that then you perpetuate this harm, right? You perpetuate this erasure of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous cultures, the ongoing living history of it. But also I think as you mentioned earlier, Bobby, that the history of residential schools is a Canadian history. It's not just an Indigenous history, right? The history of how residential schools were opened, what happened in the schools, the ongoing, as Miles, you brought up, like quote unquote controversy, right? How people are actually denying what it was that happened or questioning what it was that happened, that is Canadian, that's a Canadian story, right? And I think Lee Miracle, who in my conversations with Canadians, if folks haven't read that, it's great. She says, what really is Canadian? Denial is really Canadian. And I think it's interesting to think about that in this context, the ways in which denial so that we can maintain a innocence is really actually quite Canadian. I think about that a lot as an educator. How do I work against that, right? If that's sort of like a default state that I've internalized as a white non-Indigenous person growing up here, what is it that I can do in my classroom to ensure I'm taking up this call put forward by people like Susan Dion or Lee Miracle, not to be the perfect stranger, right? To engage in my own history, to understand that the history of residential schools is the history of white Canadians, right? Not just, well, let's let other folks deal with that. And I think Defining Moments Canada as well is engaging in this Bryce commemoration, engaging with the story of a national crime, because we want to have that conversation. We want to engage in a pedagogy that like confronts as opposed to denies. It's really important for us to think about, as was brought up before, the living history of this. And that's really important to us to think about the report. Who writes this report? Like, why is Peter Bryce, who is also a white Canadian raised in the Presbyterian Church, why is he writing this report? Why is he self-publishing it? What does it take for someone to do that? Which at the time would have been really radical. And why do people react the way that they do? And why has it taken so long for us even to be having the depth of conversation we're having about these realities as non-Indigenous Canadians? So I think that's really important for us too, to think about and to engage other teachers to support them in thinking about how to do that in their own classrooms too.
Thank you, Nya, for sharing those responses. I'm a big fan of Susan Dion's work. If anyone wants to learn more about her work, her scholarship in education is remarkable. And I always cite her literature as well, because I'm a PhD student and my work is in education. And something that also she talks about in her newest book from 2022, it's Braided Learning, talks a bit to what Canadian responsibilities and relationships are to Indigenous people. And she makes it fundamentally clear that if you live in Canada, no matter which territory or province, city, rural area, you are in relationship with Indigenous people. And she grounds that understanding in terms of treaties. A lot of people, from even when I do work with treaty education and do workshops on land acknowledgements, a lot of people don't know much about treaties. In fact, some people don't even know they exist. And sometimes I suggest a simple thing is look up the treaty in your area. And some people, it's like the best invention since sliced bread. It doesn't come across their mind to think, is there a treaty in my area? And second of all, where can I find this information? And I think that gets to what this podcast is really about. It's really bringing out that idea of this information is available and you can't ignore the truth with all the amount of information on residential schools. You were kind of getting into this in your response, Amanda, and it goes into another question I was thinking about, because part of the challenge with this, and this is kind of the issue people in history face teaching history to students or history to adults, is, and this might be from your experience as an individual teacher or from defining moments, you spoke to it a little bit, but how might we make Peter Bryce's report relevant in your classroom, in your own life? Because I think a lot of people are always asking that question: how do we make sense of like survivor testimonies, survivors' accounts of residential schools? How do we make all this information and what we find relevant to myself and people around me? I invite you to share your thoughts on that, Amanda, and we'll go to Miles after, because I think each of you have unique positions in your works, both in defining moments as a teacher and your work, Miles, as a journalist. So how do we make something from 1922 relevant to this day? I know we touched on some of it, but let's kind of put that conversation and that question forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I think that the report itself, the story of a national crime, and Dr. Bryce's work has come into popular conversation again since the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, which cited the work of Dr. Bryce, and I think has brought it into a contemporary conversation again. And I think this idea that we've talked about that has to become a reality of there being an acknowledgement of truth before we can try to engage in reconciliation. Non-Indigenous Canadians really want to get to this part where we're like, well, how do we do it? How do we like reconcile? How do we make sure that we're all good so we can stop feeling how hard it is to feel the reality of what it is that perhaps our ancestors were involved in doing, right? And the structures that now benefit us, right, that have come from these realities. And I think there's such contemporary relevance in that conversation in and of itself, right? Acknowledging these truths, which, as Miles said, we can't even all agree on, right? Acknowledging these truths, becoming active listeners in conversation, and then engaging in ways that we're being asked to engage in, or in ways that we can think about engaging. A way that I think that we can talk about the relevance of the report is engaging in truth before reconciliation, that concept, right? Truth, then reconciliation, that they're not happening simultaneously, that we have to get on the same page, right? And that non-Indigenous Canadians need to get on the page that Indigenous folks have been on for a long time, and that they've been asking us to be on, that you've been asking us to be on. And that I think Dr. Bryce's work was trying to contribute to that conversation as well. I think that we're trying in our project to make contemporary connections to, or to have conversations about how we can engage in Bryce's work just beyond reading the report itself. And I do think it's meaningful for folks to have access to the report and read the report. And we've had it translated actually into French as well. For the first time, it will be available to French folks to read and listen to, but also providing materials to think about how to engage in the kinds of conversations that Peter Bryce was trying to have at the time, the kinds of conversations that Indigenous peoples have been trying to have, right, since before Bryce was writing this report, and in an ongoing way.
The relevance of the report is because the debate is still on about what it means, because a national crime begs the question, well, what is the crime? And the crime is, at that time, would be criminal negligence causing death. That's the crime. That you knowingly put a child who's your responsibility into a place, knowingly allowing them to die, or not providing them with the necessities of life, right? So that's the crime, but it's a national crime, and it was ignored. The question is today is this a system of genocide? Right? Is the crime genocide? 100 years later, at the time, the crime would have been criminal neglect, and now after 100 years of that, then the crime becomes genocide. That uncomfortable truth. It's like, where do you want to start? Well, do you want to start there? Because if you want to start there, then what does that mean for the descendants of those people who benefited from genocide? Not from, my dad done something wrong, grandpa got some free land. No, your grandparents or great grandparents were complicit or complacent in a genocide. That's the level of conversation or truth that has to be reconciled with. And so again, as we deal with that question, and for Indigenous people, there's no question. That's not an issue, right? It's long not been a question. But again, the contemporary reality of how this we live with this is that the Pope visits Canada and is asked that question and says, yes, this was a system of genocide. Having to reconcile with that truth, as Indigenous people, is hard. Like I don't throw that word around loosely. I don't. When I realized it, I was a grown man. Obviously, I was an educated, intellectual person when I realized that. And I struggle with it, because it's just like, it was always, we always grew up. That's that was the only real good reason that anybody ever went to war, is part of the Canadian history. It was to stop this genocide. So yeah, it's a very, very difficult thing to carry around. And how do non-Indigenous people help us carry that weight? I don't know the answer to that.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of goes into a later question I have, where we get into that very idea of what can Canadians and those listening do with this history in mind. And just in your response, like that term genocide, it changes the tone of residential schools, because even in some of my works, there's always this idea they had good intentions historically for Indigenous children. And when I spoke to some people, i.e. some older people who grew up in Canada, who are non-Indigenous background, have shared with me that that's the stereotype, that's the belief they were telling children in schools, that residential schools was like it epitomizes paternalism that plays out throughout Canadian history, far back from the beginning of contact. You had the Royal Proclamation of 1763 that has paternalism spread into it. You can see how land couldn't be sold by only through the crown, not Indigenous peoples. It was meant to protect the lands, but idea of protection benefit who always is a question. And for me, that plays out through time, and that's still something I'm seeing happening today. We think about how like Indigenous children in foster care, overrepresentation of children in foster care. I know it's relevant to later topics we have planned for our podcast, but it very much is the same pattern I even see playing out through time, right? And I was just looking up here on Google, trying to find definitions of genocide, but I remember talking about that terminology historically when that concept was first drafted after 1945, and how I remember looking at the first draft, and by definition of each of those sections, Canada was guilty and would be found guilty of genocide because it hit all those areas. But what had happened through time is that Canada knew itself would be guilty of genocide, so certain things were embedded into the definition of genocide in the Geneva Convention, I think is where it is. The Genocide Convention, my bad, and how it was switched around so that it's like Canada, by some definition, would follow it, but not outright, because I forget the changing of it. But when you even look at one part, I know there was a piece that talked to the removal of children from homes. And I think you're right when you talk to that word genocide, when we start framing this discussion, because Dr. Peter Bryce, that concept had international sanction or agreements, because the convention happened much later in the 40s and into the 1940s. But I think, would he have called it genocide today? And I think he was calling it genocide back in the day. So if we start that discussion from there, it really gets into changing the tone of this idea of education, because a lot of belief there is still there that education, residential schools, i.e., was meant for the benefiting of children, or that Indigenous people were getting a free education. And that's a whole other stereotype, that whole free concept. Indigenous people get things for free, which is stereotypes. So for a larger conversation for another day. But all of this is just coming to my mind in terms of what does that mean when we think of crime, a national crime. And those listening, I would encourage you all to ask yourselves that as well. When he calls, Dr. Peter Bryce called it a national crime, why is that significant? And ask yourselves that question. If residential schools were framed as a crime and not education, how does it change the tone of what we look at in our own history in Canada? I want to go to another question, because there's so much here. And I think we're getting to the gist of what this project is about. It's to actualize this history, to actualize truth telling, the notion of we want to have reconciliation, but no one wants to do truth. And when I teach students about this in my work in the Faculty of Education, I say that term in tandem with reconciliation, truth. And you have it in sequence of truth and reconciliation, not reconciliation, then truth. And if you're not understanding what needs to be reconciled, then what is a point? So I think we need to keep telling that truth, because we can't get to that point. And also, reconciliation isn't something of an event. There's no date and time, location where reconciliation is achieved. It's an ongoing process of renewal. And that's a whole other topic again for another day. I could walk us through the histories of treaties and what that means to have renewal processes. But anyways, we'll come back to this main question I have for the both of you. And Miles, we'll go to you first, and then Amanda, you second. Is now that we have an opportunity to tell this story, for this work to exist, to read the audio file of Peter Bryce's report, Dr. Peter Bryce's report, and what message would you want to give to Canadians and those who are listening with us today? Like, what would you want them to know and do now that they know?
Well, I think that when you come to understand why or how, or the fact that there was this important document that was written, 100 years ago, that was vital to the definition of who we are as a country and the history of Indigenous Canada relations, and is such a fundamental, important part document in Canadian history, and yet, no one had heard about it. Just disappeared and was on the shelves, and it should make anybody who wants to truly understand the history of this country, they know that they've got a lot more work to do other than what they got at the Canadian schools or even at the post-secondary level. They're going to have to do a lot more work to truly understand what it means to be Canadian. And so they're the old, the idea of not that Canada didn't have a true identity. There's an identity there. They just didn't want to face it, and I think that's part of what this is about.
To build on what you're saying, Miles, that this question of how do we counteract the impulse to deny or the impulse to want to claim an innocence, right, or a distance from this, that engaging in something like the story of a national crime, really trying to conceptualize how long ago now it was written, right, and that we're still having these conversations that Bryce was having with Duncan Campbell Scott or with the Canadian Parliament, with the Canadian media at the time, thinking about how much have our conversations really changed as non-Indigenous Canadians, and how do we change what we're talking about and how we act in relationship to understanding this report and what it's really saying. And I think then it opens up, as a teacher, I automatically think of all these doors it opens up. You start engaging with the report, and then you maybe you go to the Indian Act, and it's maybe as a non-Indigenous Canadian, it's your first time ever understanding what the Indian Act is or reading it and really, really starting to engage in a conversation about that. Or, you see the name Duncan Campbell Scott, or you hear the name John A. Macdonald, and you go to documents or letters or speeches that they're giving at the time, and you really start to engage with the truth of what was being really explicitly said about what was happening in residential schools. And I think it's heavy. It can be really heavy to do that. And I think that's why it's such an ongoing journey, right, of engaging in this. And I know as teachers, there are lots of ways in which you can access support in this learning journey, often very generously led by Indigenous educators as well, right? There's additional qualifications you can take, right, in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit studies that engage in these kinds of conversations, that support you in having these conversations. And I think we're at the point today where there's no excuse. There's all these resources, right? There are all these ways in which we as non-Indigenous teachers, non-Indigenous Canadians are being supported, not just prompted, but supported and being able to engage in this kind of learning and bringing this learning to our classrooms or to the general public. And I think we're trying at Defining Moments to create another set of resources to help with that journey as well. The personal journey that a teacher would have to take, right? Or that someone would have to, a non-Indigenous Canadian would have to take to be able to face the truth of these things, and then think about, well, what's my relationship to it? Me as an individual person, what can I do in the role that I have in the world? What is possible for me? And perhaps if someone hasn't read the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation report, right, that all these things it starts to tumble, I think, once you've read one thing or once you've learned or engaged in one thing, or I hope it does. And I hope that we can provide some of the context to support people in engaging with the materials and then taking action once they've made sense of it a little bit.
For me, looking at this work and, this podcast episode on this report, something coming to my mind, that terminology of a springboard when it comes to anything that is Indigenous history, Indigenous culture, traditions, laws, whatever you name. This report and this work that we're doing, it's meant to propel people forward and get them seeing the rabbit hole and start realizing that the rabbit hole is actually far deeper than you might think. And you talked about it as well, Miles, to know what it is to be Canadian. A lot of people clutch to the idea that we mentioned earlier before, Canada is a country free of genocide or free of colonization. It's easier to look at other countries and cast judgment for human rights violations, but no one likes to look inward. And it gets even more tricky when it comes to residential schools, because these survivors now in their 50s or older Some are young as and still in their 40s. And again, this history isn't something 100 years ago. We're talking about a report 100 years ago, yes, but the last one closed in 1996. That is very recently. My grandfather went to residential school. My three uncles went to residential schools. This is something very, very recent, if not a couple hundred years ago history. And it gets even more tricky because how do you bring this content? How do you make something relevant when it comes to, the victims? And the victims are children. And that to me is what's really challenging. I think that what can deter people quite easily away from this history, that these were children taken from their families. And the call I give to people, and the idea, well, my grandparents, I didn't, they weren't involved in the system necessarily, but now you know the truth. It is your job today to do something about it, because if you don't do something about it, you're just as involved in perpetuating the problems of inequity that Indigenous peoples face. So what that means, and I tell my students this, if you hear stereotypes, you don't have to be the expert to debunk a stereotype, but you ask them, it could be as simple as, where did you find that information on what you know? And once you start hearing, they heard it from their friend, or they heard it in some sort of awkward settings, not grounded in facts, then you start seeing how things are just very much stereotypes and not very truthful. It's simple as that. You don't have to be the expert, but it is a way to move forward. And I think that idea of action, I always ground everything I do in action. This isn't just about talking about the report, but engaging in courageous conversations to transform one another's consciousness so that we all have the abilities to act and to lead meaningful change in our lives and everyone around us. All right, so that's a good discussion for this episode and this podcast.
I would like to thank Miles Morriseau and Amanda Merpaw for joining me in this discussion about the importance and impact of commemorating Dr. Peter H. Bryce's report. Our conversation today touched on terminology. Remember, Dr. Bryce was deliberate in using the term "a national crime" to describe the genocide that was happening in residential schools in the early 20th century. Subsequently, this report invalidates the argument what transpired was the act of a few bad apples. Residential schools were a systemic structure with aggressive tactics to assimilate Indigenous people by whatever means necessary. This unfortunately included loss of life for children, as Dr. Bryce found in his research in residential schools. The Story of a National Crime pamphlet presents the facts that residential school survivors courageously have been sharing when retelling their accounts. In the end, my conversation with Miles and Amanda clearly shows we cannot have reconciliation without knowing the truth, hence truth and reconciliation. Dr. Bryce witnessed and spoke out against negligence in an effort to save lives. However, nobody cared and no action was taken. Now is a time for Canadians to act and not be complacent. I would like to thank you for joining us in this important conversation for this episode of We Need to Talk About Bryce. I invite you to tune in for our next episode as we converse about Indigenous health and Indigenous wellness. Remember, residential schools left lasting legacies, but Indigenous people in Canada are making strides to improve their wellness and health. Until then, think about how Bryce's report and its legacy has affected reconciliation in your life and how you can discuss it and its impacts with those around you. This would be a good time to read The Story of a National Crime if you have not done so yet. While reading through the report, ask yourself, did I know this history? Why did I know or not know this history? And how can I mobilize what I learned? Thank you all and have a great day.